Through Darkness to Light, a story of possession, redemption, and divine grace. Part 1. Before the Darkness. James Mitchell had always considered himself a decent man. Growing up in a traditional household, his father had instilled in him an unwavering respect for women, repeatedly emphasizing that raising a hand to a woman was unthinkable unless in the most extreme circumstances of self-defense. These values had become deeply embedded in his character, making what would later transpire even more incomprehensible. His marriage to Sarah had been the culmination of a beautiful romance. They had met at a local coffee shop where she worked while putting herself through nursing school. James would often recall how her smile could brighten even his darkest days and how her laugh seemed to make the world a better place. Their wedding day had been modest, but perfect, a small ceremony in Sarah's parents' backyard, with strings of white lights twinkling above them as they exchanged their vows under a setting summer sun. The first few years of their marriage had been filled with the typical ups and downs of any young couple. They weathered financial struggles, career changes, and family dynamics, but always managed to face their challenges together. Sarah's strength and optimism balanced James's more practical nature, creating a partnership that seemed unshakable. "We can get through anything together," Sarah would often say, squeezing his hand during difficult moments. Neither of them could have imagined how those words would be tested. The subtle shift in their lives began during an economic downturn that affected James's construction business. Projects became scarcer, and the stress of maintaining their modest lifestyle began to wear on him. It started with sleepless nights spent worrying about bills, which gradually led to a deepening depression that James tried to handle on his own. "I'm fine," he would insist whenever Sarah expressed concern about his increasing withdrawal. "Just need to figure some things out." But instead of seeking professional help, James turned to marijuana to calm his racing thoughts. What started as occasional use quickly evolved into a daily habit, with James gravitating toward increasingly potent strains. He discovered a local dealer who specialized in high THC varieties, marketing them as mind-expanding substances. During this time, James also began spending countless hours online, diving deep into conspiracy websites. What began as casual curiosity about stock market manipulation theories quickly spiraled into an obsession with global conspiracies. The combination of powerful marijuana and endless hours of conspiracy research began to alter his perception of reality. Sarah watched with growing concern as her husband changed before her eyes. The man who once spent weekends working on home improvement projects now sat for hours in front of his computer, muttering about hidden truths and global cabals. His eyes, once bright and engaged, became increasingly distant and suspicious. "James, honey," she would say, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, "maybe we should talk to someone. This isn't like you." But her words seemed to bounce off an invisible wall he had built around himself. The marijuana vape pen became his constant companion, its potent vapor creating a haze through which he viewed an increasingly distorted world. Neither of them realized they were approaching a spiritual precipice, one that would test their love, their faith, and their very understanding of reality. The door to darkness was slowly creeping open, and James, in his altered state, was unwittingly extending an invitation to forces he didn't believe existed. Part 2. The Descent. The breaking point came during a particularly intense 4-day period that would forever alter their lives. James, consumed by his online research and fueled by an exceptionally potent strain of marijuana, hadn't slept in nearly 96 hours. The lack of sleep, combined with the continuous THC exposure, created a perfect storm in his consciousness. The living room of their modest home had become his command center, with multiple browser windows open on his laptop, each displaying different conspiracy theories. Empty coffee cups littered the desk, and the air was thick with a combination of marijuana vapor and tension. Sarah would later recall how the very atmosphere of their home seemed to change during those days, as if a heavy, dark presence had settled over everything. "The markets are all manipulated," James would say, his voice taking on an unfamiliar edge. "It's all connected. Can't you see it?" His hands would shake as he pointed to various charts and articles, his eyes increasingly bloodshot and wild. What James didn't understand was that his intensive vaping sessions, combined with his obsessive research, were doing more than just altering his mental state. They were actively opening his pineal gland, often referred to in esoteric circles as the third eye. This physical change, combined with his compromised mental state, created a vulnerability in his spiritual armor. The transformation began subtly at first. James started hearing whispers, barely audible suggestions that seemed to float on the edges of his consciousness. These whispers gradually became more distinct, eventually manifesting as two distinct voices engaged in what seemed like a battle for his attention. One voice was gentle, calming, speaking words of reason and concern. "You need to rest. This path leads nowhere good." The other voice was insistent, paranoid, growing louder with each passing hour. "They're all against you. You can't trust anyone, even she's part of it." Sarah, watching her husband's descent with growing alarm, noticed subtle changes in his physical appearance. His normally warm brown eyes had taken on a strange, glassy quality, and his movements became increasingly erratic. The man she loved seemed to be fading away, replaced by someone or something she didn't recognize. On the fourth day, things took a dramatic turn. James began packing the room, having animated conversations with invisible entities. His behavior became increasingly erratic, switching between moments of clarity and periods of complete dissociation. "James," Sarah approached him carefully, her nursing training kicking in as she assessed his state. "You need help. Please, let me take you to the hospital." For a brief moment, James's eyes cleared, and she saw recognition and fear in them. "Something's wrong, Sarah. I can't control it." The battle raging inside James's mind had reached a fever pitch. The gentle voice was being drowned out by the other, which had grown into a roaring cacophony of paranoid thoughts and dark suggestions. What he didn't realize was that this was no longer just mental illness or drug-induced psychosis. He had unknowingly opened himself to a powerful demonic entity. Sarah, drawing on her deep love for her husband and her professional training, managed to convince him to get into their car. As she helped him into the passenger seat, she noticed how his body temperature seemed to fluctuate between burning hot and unnaturally cold. "We're going to get through this," she said softly, starting the engine. "Just stay with me, James." But the entity that had taken hold of James had other plans. As they drove toward the hospital on that bright sunny day, the final battle for James's soul was about to begin, and neither of them was prepared for what would happen next. Part 3: The Darkness Takes Hold. The drive to the hospital became a surreal journey through what felt like two different realities. While Sarah saw the bright midday sun illuminating the familiar streets, James's world had descended into an unnatural darkness. Through his eyes, shadows seemed to writhe and twist at the edges of his vision, and the sunny day had transformed into what appeared to be midnight. Inside his mind, the battle raged with increasing intensity. The gentle voice, which James would later recognize as the Holy Spirit, continued its attempts to reach him. "Fight this. This isn't who you are. Think of Sarah." But the darker voice had grown overwhelming, drowning out reason with a torrent of paranoid accusations and violent impulses. James felt like a prisoner in his own body, watching helplessly as events unfolded around him. Sarah kept glancing worriedly at her husband as she drove. His face had taken on an ashen color, and his body trembled with occasional spasms. But what truly terrified her were his eyes. When she managed to catch a glimpse of them, she saw that they had transformed into something inhuman, blood-red and vacant, yet somehow filled with a malevolent presence. "Just a few more minutes," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "We are almost there, honey." The entity controlling James seemed to react to her words. Without any conscious decision on his part, James felt his hand moving toward his pocket. He tried to fight it, tried to stop what he knew was coming, but his body no longer responded to his commands. "No, please," he screamed internally, but no sound escaped his lips. The demon had complete control now. James's hand emerged from his pocket, holding his pocket knife. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as he watched in horror, unable to stop his own arm from raising the blade. Sarah, focused on driving, didn't see the movement until it was too late. In that terrible moment, just before the blade struck, James's voice emerged, but it wasn't his own. It was a deep, guttural sound that formed a single word: Satan. The knife plunged into Sarah's chest with surgical precision, missing her heart by a fraction of an inch. Later, medical professionals would marvel at how the blade had managed to avoid any major arteries while still collapsing her lung, a trajectory that seemed impossibly precise. Sarah's training as a nurse helped her maintain enough composure to pull the car over safely, even as shock and pain threatened to overwhelm her. She managed to stumble out of the vehicle, waving desperately at passing traffic for help. Inside the car, James was experiencing his own horror. The demonic presence seemed to recede slightly, allowing him to realize what had just happened. The darkness that had filled his vision began to lift, revealing the terrible reality of what his possessed body had done. "Oh God, no," he moaned, finally able to control his own voice again. He stumbled out of the car, his mind reeling with guilt and horror. In his anguish, he started walking toward oncoming traffic, intent on ending his own life. But even in this darkest moment, divine intervention was at work. The same people who had stopped to help Sarah quickly noticed James's intention and managed to wave off approaching vehicles. An off-duty police officer who had arrived at the scene tackled James to the ground. As he was being restrained, James's mind oscillated between clarity and confusion. He rambled about stock market crashes and global conspiracies while the demon toyed with his consciousness, but underneath it all was a devastating awareness of what had happened to Sarah. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air as emergency vehicles responded to the scene. As James was being handcuffed, he caught one last glimpse of Sarah being attended to by paramedics. The sight of her blood-stained shirt would haunt him for years to come. Part 4: The Dark Night of the Soul. The county jail's harsh fluorescent lights and cold concrete walls became James's new reality. The initial booking process passed in a blur of fingerprints, mugshots, and hostile stares from corrections officers who had already labeled him as just another domestic abuser. But unlike most inmates facing similar charges, James's primary concern wasn't for himself, it was for Sarah. "Please," he begged repeatedly, "just tell me if she's alive." The responses from the guards varied from cold indifference to cruel taunting. One particularly bitter officer sneered, "What do you care? You tried to kill her." The words cut deep, not just because of their harshness, but because James knew they didn't understand. he hadn't tried to kill her. Something else had used his body as a weapon against the person he loved most. For 3 agonizing days, James existed in a state of desperate uncertainty. The demon that had possessed him was gone, but it had left behind a devastating wake of destruction and guilt. In his 8x10 cell, James alternated between packing frantically and curling up on his thin mattress, trying to piece together the horrifying events that had led him there. The other inmates largely avoided him, perhaps sensing something different about his case. Unlike the typical domestic violence offenders who often tried to justify their actions or blame their victims, James's genuine distress and constant concern for Sarah's well-being set him apart. On the 3rd day, a night shift officer named Martinez noticed James's genuine anguish. During his rounds, he paused at James's cell. "You really don't know if she made it, do you?" Martinez asked, his voice softer than the other guards. "No, sir," James replied, his voice cracking. "Please, I just need to know she's alive." Martinez studied him for a long moment, seeming to weigh something in his mind. Finally, he spoke quietly. "She's alive, made it through surgery, that's all I can tell you." The relief that flooded through James was overwhelming. He collapsed onto his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, Jesus," he whispered, though he hadn't been religious before this moment. Something about the precision of the knife wound, missing Sarah's heart by such a tiny margin, struck him as more than coincidence. That evening, while other inmates watched TV or played cards, James noticed a small religious tract that had been left in his cell. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, he began to read. The words spoke of forgiveness, of Jesus' sacrifice for all sins, no matter how grave. They spoke of spiritual warfare and the reality of demonic forces, but also of a God powerful enough to overcome them. For the first time, James began to understand what had happened to him. The marijuana use, the sleep deprivation, the obsession with conspiracies. He had opened a door to something dark and powerful. But even in that darkness, a greater power had been present, ensuring that Sarah survived. In the quiet of his cell, James fell to his knees again, this time with a different purpose. His prayer wasn't eloquent or formal, just the raw, honest words of a broken man. "Jesus, I don't deserve your forgiveness. I opened myself to evil and someone I love paid the price. But if you're real, if you're listening, I need you. Please forgive me. Please come into my heart and help me understand what happened. Help me make whatever amends I can. I give my life to you." The change wasn't dramatic or instantaneous. No lights flashed, no angels sang, but something shifted in James's spirit. A peace he had never known began to settle over him, even in the midst of his circumstances. The crushing weight of guilt didn't disappear, but it began to transform into something else, a deep remorse coupled with hope for redemption. Part 5. Divine Intervention in the Courts. The legal process that followed seemed designed to crush whatever hope James had found in his newfound faith. His court-appointed public defender, Mr. Thompson, while knowledgeable about the law, appeared almost paralyzed in the courtroom. The man would literally shrink in his seat when faced with the stern glare of Judge Harrison, a veteran of the bench known for her harsh sentences in domestic violence cases. During preliminary hearings, James observed how Judge Harrison's eyes would harden whenever she looked in his direction. Her tone, while professionally maintained, carried an undercurrent of personal disgust. As someone who had always despised domestic violence himself, James understood her reaction, yet the irony of his situation weighed heavily on him. "Your Honor," Mr. Thompson would stammer during proceedings, "my client has no prior record of violence." "Counsel," Judge Harrison would interrupt sharply, "the severity of this single incident more than makes up for any lack of prior offenses. The situation seemed hopeless. The evidence was clear. James had stabbed his wife in broad daylight. The fact that he had been experiencing a drug-induced psychosis only made matters worse in the eyes of the court. The prosecution was pushing for the maximum sentence of 10 years, and Judge Harrison seemed more than inclined to grant it. However, James noticed small signs that he took as divine intervention. During one hearing, a seasoned court clerk approached him privately during a recess. "I've been working these courts for 20 years, she whispered, glancing around to ensure no one was within earshot. "Something about your case feels different. I've seen hundreds of domestic violence cases, but the way you talk about your wife, the way you pray before each hearing, keep faith." The most significant breakthrough came when Sarah was interviewed by the court-appointed psychologist, Dr. Rebecca Chen. During the interview, Sarah revealed a crucial detail that James himself hadn't remembered: his declaration of Satan just before the stabbing. When James read this in the psychological evaluation report, everything clicked into place. The possession hadn't been just a feeling or an explanation he'd created to cope with his actions. It had been terrifyingly real. As the sentencing date approached, James prepared himself for the worst. Mr. Thompson had advised him to expect the full 10-year sentence, given Judge Harrison's reputation and the brutal nature of the crime. But then, something remarkable happened. The morning of the sentencing, the courthouse was buzzing with unexpected news. Judge Harrison had been called away for an emergency federal judiciary conference. Her replacement, Judge Michael Collins, was known for his more rehabilitative approach to justice. When James entered the courtroom that day, he felt a peculiar sense of peace. Judge Collins reviewed the case files carefully, paying particular attention to James's lack of prior offenses, his consistent show of remorse, and the unusual circumstances surrounding the incident. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Collins addressed him directly, "I've reviewed your case thoroughly. While the severity of your actions cannot be overlooked, I've also taken into account your clean record, your evident remorse, and what appears to be a genuine psychological and spiritual transformation during your incarceration." The courtroom held its breath as Judge Collins continued. "It's this court's belief that extended incarceration would serve neither justice nor society in this case. Therefore, I am sentencing you to time served, plus 1 year of probation." The prosecutor's objection was immediate, but Judge Collins remained firm. The conditions of probation included mandatory counseling, drug testing, and most importantly, no contact with Sarah for at least 1 year. As James was led back to his cell to process his release, he overheard 2 court officers discussing how unprecedented it was for Judge Harrison to be called away for an emergency conference. Apparently, it had never happened before in her 15 years on the bench. That evening, in his cell for what would be the last time, James reflected on the extraordinary series of events that had led to this moment. He didn't see luck or coincidence in Judge Harrison's absence or in Judge Collins taking her place. He saw the hand of God, working even through the legal system to bring about his purposes. Part 6: Healing and Understanding. The transition back into the outside world brought its own unique challenges. James emerged from jail into a bright spring morning, carrying nothing but a small bag of belongings and a profound new understanding of spiritual warfare. His parents were waiting for him, their faces a mixture of relief, concern, and lingering confusion about everything that had happened. "You're coming home with us," his mother said firmly, leaving no room for argument. "We've got the spare room ready." Her eyes held a combination of maternal love and wariness, the look of someone who wants to trust, but has witnessed something they can't fully comprehend. The first few weeks of freedom were spent largely in isolation, apart from mandatory counseling sessions and meetings with his probation officer. James spent hours in prayer and Bible study, trying to understand the spiritual realm that had so violently introduced itself into his life. His mother would often pause outside his room, listening with concern as he spoke to God in long, intense conversations. "Mama," he tried to explain one evening, "I know it sounds crazy, but I can hear him now. Not like regular voices, but it's like thoughts that aren't mine, but they're full of love and truth." His mother's face had paled at this admission, her mind immediately going back to the possession incident. "James, honey, are you sure?" "It's different," he assured her quickly. "When the demon was there, everything was chaos and darkness. This is peace, pure peace." During one of his prayer sessions, James felt compelled to ask about the entity that had possessed him. The name, Azazel, came to him with startling clarity. The revelation sent him into deep research, leading him to ancient texts and religious scholars who identified Azazel as one of Satan's most powerful lieutenants, known specifically for inciting violence between loved ones. Meanwhile, through family members, James learned that Sarah was healing well physically. She had returned to work, and while the trauma of that day remained, she was slowly rebuilding her life. He respected the no-contact order completely, channeling his continued love for her into prayers for her healing and happiness. About 6 months after his release, James learned that Sarah had begun dating someone new. The news brought an unexpected peace, a feeling he recognized as coming from the Holy Spirit. "This is good," the gentle thought came to him. "She deserves joy." His own healing process continued through regular counseling sessions with Pastor David Matthews, who helped him understand the spiritual aspects of what had happened to him. The pastor explained how drug use, especially combined with sleep deprivation, could create spiritual vulnerabilities. "Think of your soul like a house," Pastor Matthews explained during one session. "Every time you engage with darkness, drugs, occult practices, even extreme paranoia, you're cracking a window, opening a door. The enemy is always looking for those openings." James began speaking at small church groups, sharing his testimony despite knowing some would dismiss it as excuse-making or delusion. He felt compelled to warn others about the reality of spiritual warfare and the dangers of unwittingly opening doors to darkness. "I'm not here to convince you," he would begin each testimony. "I'm here to share what I know is true. Demons are real, but God is more real, and his love is more powerful than any darkness." Years passed, and James learned that Sarah had married and had children. The news filled him with genuine happiness, a feeling that would have seemed impossible in those dark days after the incident. He continued to pray for her and her family, grateful that God had not only saved her life, but had given her a new beginning. Part 7. A New Purpose. As the years passed, James's spiritual journey deepened in ways he never could have imagined during those dark days in his jail cell. His experiences had given him a unique perspective on spiritual warfare and the reality of supernatural forces that most people only encountered in movies or books. This understanding became both his cross to bear and his calling to share. He began documenting his observations about the subtle ways darkness tried to enter people's lives. The contemporary world, he noticed, had created countless small doors through which evil could seep in: mindless entertainment that normalized violence, spiritual practices stripped of their original warnings, and drugs marketed as paths to enlightenment. "The enemy's greatest trick," he would often say during his testimony meetings, "isn't convincing the world he doesn't exist. It's convincing us that he's not dangerous, that it's all just movies and fairy tales. James developed a particularly effective ministry, helping others who struggled with drug-induced spiritual experiences. His own story served as both a warning and a beacon of hope. He could speak their language, understand their experiences, and offer practical spiritual guidance that many traditional counselors couldn't provide. One evening, while preparing for a speaking engagement, he received an unexpected email. It was from Sarah's sister, breaking years of silence. James, Sarah wanted you to know she's forgiven you completely. She's been following your ministry work through mutual friends. She understands now that something truly supernatural happened that day. While she can't forget it, she believes your story. She's happy you found your purpose through it all. The message brought tears to his eyes, not of regret or sorrow this time, but of gratitude for God's ability to bring healing and understanding, even from the darkest circumstances. His research into Azazel continued, leading him to recognize patterns in other cases of family violence that seemed inexplicable. He began to see how popular media had been subtly programming people to accept darkness as entertainment, while making light of genuine spiritual warfare. Hollywood shows us truth disguised as fiction, he would explain to his study groups. They put it right in front of us, but package it as entertainment so we won't take it seriously. Meanwhile, real spiritual battles are happening every day. James never remarried, feeling called instead to focus on his ministry work. His relationship with Jesus and the Holy Spirit grew increasingly intimate, characterized by those gentle thought communications that had once frightened his mother. Now, she had come to recognize the peace and wisdom that flowed through her son's life. The voices are different now, he would explain to those who questioned his experiences. Evil shouts, demands, creates chaos. God whispers, suggests, brings peace. Once you know the difference, you can never be fooled again. His testimony began reaching broader audiences, particularly as mental health professionals started recognizing the need to address spiritual aspects of certain cases. James found himself bridging the gap between traditional psychiatric care and spiritual healing, always careful to acknowledge the importance of both. Yes, get medical help, he would advise. Yes, take your medications if you need them, but don't ignore the spiritual realm. It's just as real as the physical one and sometimes more dangerous. Through it all, James maintained his message of hope. No matter how many times he shared his story, he always emphasized that God's forgiveness was available to everyone, that no sin was too great, no darkness too deep for God's light to penetrate. I opened a door to one of hell's most powerful demons, he would conclude his testimonies. I watched helplessly as it used my body to hurt someone I loved, but even then, God was present. He guided that knife away from Sarah's heart. He brought me to my knees in that jail cell. He transformed what the enemy meant for destruction into a testimony of his power and love. The world remained a dark place, perhaps growing darker by the day, but James had learned to carry his own light. His experiences had taught him that the greatest battles weren't fought with physical weapons, but with prayer, discernment, and unwavering faith in a God who could bring good out of even the darkest circumstances. This isn't just my story, he would say. It's a wake-up call. The spiritual realm is real, more real than most of us know. But God's love is the most real thing of all. And in the end, love always wins. Epilogue: The Light That Remains. 10 years after the incident that changed everything, James stood at the podium of a major spiritual warfare conference, facing an audience of over 2,000 people. Among them were pastors, counselors, addiction specialists, and countless individuals who had experienced their own battles with darkness. The scars of his past had become credentials in a war most people didn't even know they were fighting. As he prepared to speak, his eyes caught something unexpected in the back of the room. Sarah was there, sitting quietly beside her husband. She had contacted him through the conference organizers, asking if she could attend. It was their first time in the same room since that fateful day. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave him a small, gentle nod, a gesture of peace that spoke volumes. "You know my story," James began, his voice steady and clear. "But what you don't know is that today, sitting in this room, is the woman whose life was nearly taken that day. She's here not as a victim, but as a witness to God's protection and power." The room fell silent as James continued. "The demon Azazel intended to destroy 2 lives that day, to take her life and damn my soul. Instead, God used that moment to save us both, her physically, me spiritually. That's how God works. He doesn't just defeat darkness, he transforms it into light." That evening, after the conference, Sarah and her husband met briefly with James in the presence of conference organizers. The conversation was short but profound. "I understand now," Sarah said simply. "I've seen enough in my nursing career to know there are things in this world we can't explain. What happened that day, it wasn't you, James, and God has used it to help so many others." Her husband, a strong Christian himself, added, "Your ministry has helped us understand spiritual warfare in our own work with troubled youth. God really does work all things together for good." As James drove home that night, he reflected on how far God had brought him from that dark day. His ministry now included a network of prayer warriors specifically trained in spiritual warfare, a rehabilitation program for those affected by drug-induced spiritual experiences, and a growing collection of documented cases showing the intersection of substance abuse and demonic activity. But more than any of these accomplishments, what moved him most was the simple fact that God could take the worst moment of someone's life and turn it into a source of hope for others. The enemy's greatest weapons, violence, possession, destruction, had been transformed into tools for kingdom building. In his quiet moments, James still struggled with the memory of that day, but the guilt had been replaced by gratitude. He had learned that God's forgiveness was not just a theological concept, but a transformative power that could reshape the darkest chapters of life into testimonies of his grace. The world, he knew, was still full of Azazel's ancient, powerful forces of darkness seeking to destroy lives and relationships. But he also knew something far more important, that no force of darkness, no matter how powerful, could overcome the light of God's love. In the end, James would write in his journal that night, "This was never really my story. It's a story about a God who can reach into the deepest pit, break the strongest chains, heal the deadliest wounds, and bring light from absolute darkness." And he's still writing stories like this today for anyone willing to let him transform their darkness into light. And so James continued his work, knowing that somewhere in the world, someone else was facing their own battle with darkness, needing to hear that no matter how dark the night, dawn would come. Because in God's kingdom, every scar becomes a story, every wound becomes a witness, and every tragedy can become a testimony of his transforming love.